morning, everyone, or good evening to those joining us from Korea. Welcome to GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWIX. I'm Yeon-ho Kim, Associate Director of GWIX. Thank you for joining our Korea Policy Forum on Global Semiconductor Supply Chain and US-ROK Cooperation. Today's forum is co-sponsored by the East Asia National Resource Center and the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy at GW. With that, let me turn it over to Jisoo Kim, Director of GWIX, and Nick Vonartus, Senior Associate Dean of the GW Elliott School, for opening remarks. Jisoo?
Thanks, Yeon-ho. Good morning. Thanks for joining our first Korea Policy Forum of this academic year. I'm very delighted that GWIX is hosting today's panel discussion on the hottest topic, which is the global supply chain. When President Joe Biden visited South Korea in May to have a summit meeting with President Yoon Suk-yeol, Biden visited Samsung Semiconductor plant as the first item on his schedule before the formal summit meeting with Yoon. And based on the joint statement on cooperation on global supply chains published after the meeting, it's very clear that the primary interest lies in economic security, which is broadly defined to include areas such as semiconductors, batteries, civil nuclear power, space development, cyberspace, and other emerging industries. Both countries agreed to launch an economic security dialogue to continue discussions in these areas. It would be interesting to see how this dialogue on economic security evolves and shapes the US-ROK relationship and the meaning of alliance under the current US and ROK administrations. Before I turn it over to Senior Associate Dean Nick Vonartus, I would like to thank the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy for co-sponsoring today's event. It's great that we are collaborating on this important topic. I hope GWIX and ISTP can continue to work together on this issue to host policy discussions at the Elliott School. I would also like to thank our distinguished speakers for sharing their thoughts on this very important topic. Thanks to Yeon-ho for organizing today's panel discussion. Unfortunately, I would have to leave before the roundtable discussion. My apologies in advance that I have to leave early. No offense. I have a class to teach this morning, but I do plan to catch up on the discussions I missed later through our video. I look forward to learning from our speakers today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, or good evening if you are in Korea. I am Nick Vonartus. Until very recently, I was the director of the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy, and I was very excited actually to participate, to accept the invitation and participate to co-sponsor this event. This is a hugely important event, of course, an issue for us because the trilogy of policies that have just gone through the US Congress, and I mean the CHIPS and science, the infrastructure, and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, all of them together have at its core semiconductors and global value chains and relationships with other countries. So we are very excited to participate in this event. And in fact, 2 weeks from tomorrow, I will be talking about the same issue, basically, in a conference that in Seoul, organized by Seoul National University and Fraunhofer from Germany, the German organization, on so-called technology sovereignty. These are all these new terms that are being floated around the world now these days as we dismantling some old value chains and creating new ones, right? So there's a huge interest around. So thank you very much, Yeon-ho. Thank you very much, Jisoo. Thank you very much, the speakers today and the participants. I am intensely interested in the event, and I will certainly watch the video to understand what went on here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I'm sure you will dominate the discussion with all the information you will get.
I will copy you today. I want to hear what happened.
Yes, thanks. With that, let me start our roundtable discussion. We are lucky to have 4 distinguished speakers today, joining from Seoul and Washington. Let me introduce the Korean speakers first before they get sleepy. It's late night in Seoul. Young Jae is a professor in the Department of Political Science and Diplomacy at Konkuk University. She serves on the Policy Advisory Committee to the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Vice Chairman of the Korean Association of International Studies. And Hee-kwon Kyung is an Associate Research Fellow of the Korea Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade, or KIET. His recent research focuses on the economic impacts and policy implications of US-China strategic rivalry in the fields of semiconductor and advanced ICT industry. So we have the right person today. Our next speaker is Lisa Porter, the co-founder and co-president of LogicQ Inc. Lisa was the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. And she also served as the first director of the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects activity in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the Associate Administrator for the Aeronautics Research Mission Directorate at NASA. Last but not least, Shahid Yusuf is Chief Economist of the Growth Dialogue at the George Washington University's School of Business. He is a non-resident fellow of the Center for Global Development and previously was on the staff of the World Bank. With that, let me turn it over to Lisa and ask her to discuss how to advance economic security in semiconductor supply chains from the US point of view. Lisa?
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me. This is a very interesting forum. I'm very pleased to be here this morning. It's this morning in the East Coast, just for those of you who are watching. So I wanted to, first of all, make clear, I was the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering under the prior administration. So my views that I express here do not represent the US government. I'm not official in any capacity. They were certainly informed by my time there, however. You will soon learn that I'm extremely blunt. I will just tell you, the best facts that I can give you and the best perspectives I can give you. So take it for what it's worth. But I wanted to set the stage here because I think it's really important when we talk about this really important issue, the global microelectronics supply chain. Some truths or facts are getting kind of lost or diminished in the discussion. So I just wanted to take a step back and remind everyone that the supply chain as it exists today, it's evolved into this globally distributed and highly intertwined network of thousands and thousands of participants. And it has evolved that way through free market principles primarily, and it's been optimized for efficiency and innovation. And because of the way it has optimized, it has enabled enormous growth in multiple industries. If you look at the top 10 companies in the world by market cap in 2021, for example, you'll see Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, Facebook, Tesla. These happen to be all US companies. They also happen to be dominating the world stage in large part because of the underpinning of this particular industry, the microelectronics industry. And probably even more important for a broader audience is the consumer access to a wide variety of technological capability that has been made possible by the current global supply chain. And I would emphasize, because people just forget, they take for granted that most of us walk around with smartphones in our pockets or our purses, and they don't necessarily realize just the incredible complexity of what it takes in terms of capital investment, in terms of human capital, as well as monetary capital investment to make the chips that we all take for granted. It's absolutely eye-watering. Most people have never, for example, even been to a fab to see what it takes, the kinds of precision and expertise that are involved. And yet we take for granted the incredible, frankly, cost affordability that this global supply chain has enabled for not just for the US, but for the world. So I emphasize that because we all have, of course, experienced the downside to efficiency, and that is that the current supply chain has exhibited a lack of resilience, right? And we've seen, I don't have to go on and on about COVID's impact, current geopolitical tensions. I would also note the increased threat activity, IP theft, cyber attacks, counterfeiting, et cetera. All of these things have highlighted that the current supply chain is not sufficiently resilient. And as a result, the US government and other governments have responded the way governments usually do, unfortunately, and they're just throwing money at the problem, but they're not really clarifying what problem it is they're actually trying to solve. So I would put forward, and I think it's really important for us to think not just from a US perspective, but from a US allies and partners perspective. How do we improve the resilience without eliminating its strengths? And that's the key point that I think people are forgetting. There's a lot of goodness that we don't want to throw out as we talk about improving the resilience. And so in my opinion, and again, this is not the US government opinion, clearly, I think we have a myopic obsession with onshoring going on right now because it sounds really good. However, onshoring the entire global semiconductor manufacturing life cycle for all kinds of semiconductors is infeasible, and it's also undesirable. I mean, people have to realize that every part of the chip making process requires deep specialization. There is no part of the supply chain that can be simply and quickly duplicated. And unfortunately, the focus has been on the most visible parts of the supply chain, and notably the fabs. That's where you're seeing a lot of the money going now. But there are hundreds of raw materials and chemicals and consumable parts and gases and metals and so forth, without which the precise process of chip making just cannot happen. I would also point out, really importantly, that the US population, according to projected November 2022 numbers, is going to be only about 4% of the global population, which is going to hit 8 billion in November. And I would point out ROKs is even lower at about 0.6%. So where is all the talent going to come from to staff all these high-tech positions if everybody really wants to onshore everything locally? In fact, if countries keep trying, if multiple countries try to do this, you're going to have a huge excess capacity and the costs are just going to go through the roof. And the consumers are the ones that are going to be impacted. And suddenly this wonderful supply chain in terms of keeping the costs down and electronics affordable, it gets broken. So I think we have to be very thoughtful when we talk about addressing resilience. And I would also point out that onshoring does not guarantee security, despite some people's perspectives in the government, in particular, the US government, and they forget about perimeter defense. So, Edward Snowden in the intelligence community was a stark reminder for the US government that onshoring doesn't help. He was a US citizen. He was in one of the most safe and secure places on the planet, up at the NSA, and yet he was able to do untold damage to our country. SolarWinds is a very recent example in the cyber domain. You've all heard of it, I'm sure, a US company, and yet hacked by the Russians very effectively and had a tremendous impact on thousands of companies and agencies. So this notion that by moving everything onshore, you will make things more secure is a fallacy, and people have to be mindful of that. And so I don't want to dominate by talking too long. I just want to briefly introduce, because I don't want to throw out something without introducing an alternative perspective. The approach that I've been advocating for, and others have been as well, is something called applying zero trust. And in Washington, D.C., this phrase has become very, very popular. I don't know if it's also becoming popular in Korea, and I'd be interested to hear about that. But in the D.C. area, it has become so popular that it's even being uttered by the White House itself, and certainly by the Department of Homeland Security and the National Security Agency and other places that are seen to be sort of the spokespeople for how do you think about cybersecurity. And I know this audience is not, I don't have time anyway, deeply technical to go into all of the details, but I did want to give you a broad perspective of what it means. It basically means that it's a strategy, okay? It says, look, let's think about designing, building, operating systems by eliminating trust as a goal. So trust is a human emotion, and it does not belong in complex engineered systems. And so this focus on trying to make things trusted, trying to make things perfectly secure is actually an approach that is not only naive, but it's dangerous because trust is a vulnerability that can be exploited. And again, I've referenced the Snowden example, SolarWinds, the Colonial Pipeline, all of these things that people are actually becoming very aware of. These are all examples of what happens when you try to design for trust. What we should be doing is focusing on resilience. And resilience is not assuming perfection, it's designing in assuming risk, right? So it's really an approach that says, let's not try to eliminate risk, but let's mitigate it. And let's do it through continuous data-driven, quantitative risk assessment and management. And this is something that allows for tailorable approaches, risk commensurate with the need. It allows for cost trades. And it's a very quantitative approach to managing the reality of the real world. And when I talk about this, just so you know, to system engineers, and I have a technical background, so I spend most of my time in the engineering and physics world. System engineers hear about zero trust and they say, oh, you're actually talking about resilience. We have formal definition for that. And the way we build resilience into our systems, if we're good at it and we know what we're doing, is we are looking at it from a risk perspective and we use risk matrices. And all that is a way of essentially cataloging the risks as best as you can by their probability of occurrence and consequence. And it allows you to apply your resources where those highest probability and consequence events are likely to be. And it allows you to mitigate it. And allows you to do it in a very logical and deliberate fashion. And a key point about this, and when you talk to system engineers, you'll know, they don't take this as a one-time thing. Risk assessment and management is a continual process. You're continually learning and you're changing and adapting accordingly. And there is no finish line, if you will, to risk assessment and management. So there's no easy button here. You have to be thinking about your system as something that is constantly evolving based on the environment it's in and the threats that are out there. And you have to be measuring and monitoring and adapting. And so what I would say is, if you're interested in learning more about the technical thoughts behind this as it applies to the supply chain, I will tell you that I gave a talk on this topic at the Compound Semiconductor Manufacturing Technology Conference a few months ago in Monterey, California. And I'd be happy to send anyone a link who might be interested. It's a very brief paper, it's 3 pages, but it gives a little more detail about how you could go about doing this. But I would strongly advocate for, and perhaps we can talk more in the roundtable discussion, for the US and our allies and partners adopting a global approach to implementing zero trust. We collectively need to collaborate with both the commercial suppliers and the customers, those who provide the demand signal, to define the risk methodology that we want to put in place at every stage of the life cycle. And if we do this openly and smartly, like through standards bodies, which is how these things are typically done, zero trust will cost far less to implement than trying to recreate the entire supply chain in multiple geographic locations. And I would point out, and I think people do understand this, those who define the standards of an industry are the ones who have the most influence over it. So for countries like the US and Korea, where we just don't have a population dominance in this world, the way we have outsized influence in large part is through the standards development processes that allow us to influence what gets built and how it gets built. So we really want to think about employing a zero trust philosophy, establishing risk standards, and promulgating those throughout the global supply chain. And I would also point out that the zero trust emphasis on continual measurement and feedback will also enable improved yields and performance. When I talk about implementing a continual monitoring process throughout the life cycle, people who are not familiar with manufacturing in this industry kind of assume, oh my gosh, that's so much extra cost. And they're not aware of just how much measurement is already being done in the fabs today. It's a tremendous amount of measurements are being made because yield is such a critical factor for making things work economically. And so there's a lot of existing measurements that already occur. more measurements should lead to even better control over what is being done throughout the life cycle. But those measurements are going to be required anyway as the demand signal from like the automotive industry, for example, starts to indicate that, hey, we need failure rates less than parts per billion. Because if you do simple math and you look at how many chips are going to be in cars of the near future, you're talking about thousands and thousands of them. So your parts per billion is really what it's going to take to ensure your cars aren't breaking down all the time. And that will drive demand for measurements earlier and earlier in the life cycle. So a zero trust approach is commensurate and aligned with improved performance, which is what we're going to need anyway. So I would say that zero trust overall is my counter to this sort of naive, we're just going to onshore everything and subsidize a few fabs and think that's going to solve the problem. And with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you,
Hopefully
Lisa.
that wasn't too long. I tried to time it so it wasn't too much talking.
No, it was great. You just provided us with a great food for thoughts, and I'm sure our roundtable discussion is going to be really exciting. Youngja?
Hi, I'm Youngja Bae, and I'm glad to join the Korea Policy Forum and meet you. Today, I'm going to talk on semiconductor and economic security in US and Korea. First of all, I would like to mention that it's not easy to define clearly what the economic security means. In reality, I think the object and contents of security differs depending on who defines security. So when we talk about semiconductor and economic security, it needs to be more accurately stated who is threatened by what and what should be protected. In the US case, referring to the various reports and talks, it seems the primary issue from the US economic security perspective is to ensure the safety and resilience of the semiconductor supply chain, and more specifically, to secure the advanced semiconductor manufacturing in the United States. The worst case scenario for the US in the semiconductor sector might be that China quickly outpaces Taiwan and Korea in semiconductor fabrication technology, so that US fabless companies like Apple and NVIDIA have to entrust their chip manufacturing to Chinese companies. I would say that the US feel most threatened by the lack of advanced semiconductor manufacturing technology domestically and the rapid development of this technology in China. Now, having the CHIPS and Science Act to provide significant support for domestic chip manufacturing facilities, the United States has been strengthening the cooperation with China, Taiwan, and Japan, requesting Korean and Taiwanese firms to invest and build up the cutting-edge chip facilities in the United States. US seeks to secure domestic manufacturing facilities and contain China's technological rise at the same time. I think the former, having a cutting-edge manufacturing facility in the territory of United States, seems to be the clearer and more important goal for the US. What about Korea then? Semiconductor occupies about 20% of Korean total export, and it is one of the major pillars of Korean economy. Recently, in Korea, there are lots of discussion going on from the economic security viewpoint over US-led reorganization of the semiconductor supply chain and whether Korea would participate in US-led semiconductor supply chain network we call the chip war or fat war. So far, most of this discussion argues that Korea's participation in chip war is inevitable given the Korea-US alliance and United States status in the semiconductor industry. However, considering that China is running against Korea's participation in Chip 4, some have argued that Korea-China cooperation should continue to be pursued very carefully, and Korea needs to cooperate with United States firms, but should not pursue an explicitly anti-China direction. By what do Koreans feel most threatened regarding semiconductor? Obviously, it is impossible for Korean firms, to produce semiconductor without U.S. firms' equipment and software. So stable supply of U.S. equipment and software is critical. However, at the same time, China's continuous imports of Korean semiconductors and operations of Korean manufacturing facilities in China are also important to Korean semiconductor industry. Currently, Samsung produced 14% of nanochips in China, and SK Hynix also produces about half of its DRAM chip in China, and China accounts, 60%, huge amount of, percentage, 60% of Korea's semiconductor export market. More than anything else, from the economic security perspective, I think Korea should continue to upgrade advanced semiconductor fabrication technology so that Korea could stabilize its position as one of the major producers and providers of cutting-edge chips in global semiconductor supply chain. So in this sense, China's rapid rise in semiconductor sector has been a great challenge to Korea, as well as the United States. Recently, China's technological pursuit have progressed faster than expected, despite all the regulations on export and investment. As we are seeing a report in the Chinese company, one of the big fab in China, SMIC, became capable of producing 7-nanometer chip, cutting-edge chip line. The United States and South Korea have a common interest in accelerating semiconductor technology innovation through cooperation and widening the technology gap with China. South Korea and the United States have taken complementary part in the semiconductor supply chain and continue to collaborate and advance the semiconductor industry together. Several issues are being raised from Korea's point of view in the future development of Korea-US cooperation in the semiconductor sector. The CHIPS and Science Act stipulate that a new or additional investment in China would be prohibited for the next 10 years for the companies seeking to receive US government subsidy under the law, so-called guardrails. If these guardrails are implemented, there will be setback in upgrading fabs in China operated by Korean firms, and thereafter the proportion of Samsung and SK Hynix investment in China could inevitably be adjusted downward. So China, the Korean company's operation of semiconductor fabs in China is strongly affected by the US government export control and investment restriction policies. When Korea participates in Chip 4, it is good for both countries to start talk on this adjustment within the scope of decreasing damage to the interests of Korean manufacturing facilities in China. Currently, Korean firms are investing heavily for advanced semiconductor manufacturing in the US. Until Korean firms could establish a very stable position in US market, competing and cooperating with Intel, US firm, and TSMC, Taiwanese firm, there are expected barriers in terms of proper supply of manpower, high production cost, and US government subsidies. To overcome these issues, continuous support and attention from the US government are required for Korean firms' US investment. When US would emerge as the new center of the semiconductor manufacturing as planned, I'm not so sure. I want to ask about it to our participants. Anyway, US is planning to do that. And South Korean companies should consider on how the division of labor between US and Korean firms could evolve. So in order for Korean firms, US investment in semiconductor manufacturing and participation in Chip 4 to lead to a positive feedback cycle for the further development of the Korean and US semiconductor industry, firms and government in both countries should continuously negotiate, striving to maximize the benefit of cooperation. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Obviously, the China factor is going to be a big issue to be discussed at our roundtable discussion. So thank you for raising that issue. And next, I'd like to ask Hee-kwon to discuss a little bit more detail about South Korea's semiconductor industry in the context of global semiconductor supply chains.
Hi, I'm Hee-kwon Kyung, an associate research fellow at Korean Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade. We help Korean Ministry of Industry shaping industrial policies. So we've been studying the recent development of American semiconductor policy for the last couple of years. So I'm gonna get right into it. First topic is the current state of Korean semiconductor trade. As you might aware, over 60% of Korean memory chips are exported to China. China imports so much of Korean chips, so if China retaliates against Korea due to our too close cooperation with the United States, in their perspective, historically it took a form of asymmetric tactics. It is that China attacks other industries, not semiconductor industry itself, but where we are almost completely dependent of Chinese imports. But first, why are so many Korean chips being exported to China? This data is from Gartner Devices market report. For the last decade, China emerged as the center of electronic manufacturing services, producing so many smartphones, desktops, laptops, and other ICT devices. So they need memory chips with competitive pricing and quality. So it's not our fault that we export more than 60% of memory chips to China, but it is one of the inevitable consequences of globalization of manufacturing industries seeking somewhere to make them goods. But I believe there is actually a silver lining, is that electronic manufacturing industry is rapidly rising up in the Indo-Pacific countries, and so is the potential as a huge market for ICT devices. As you can see in the World Population Prospects, recently released by the United Nations, Indian population now exceeds 14 billion people, together with China. And the average age of Indian population is about 28.7, much younger than 38.4, which is Chinese. And Prime Minister of India, Modi, introduced the PLI scheme, performance-linked incentives, which pours more than $30 billion to companies manufacturing smartphones, computers, tablet PCs, communication equipment, etc. Last year, about 1.4 billion smartphones were produced, and out of that, about 13% of them were made in India and Samsung. And the second topic, the end game of the United States and Korea's role in that big picture. Now, everybody knows that the Chips and Science Act of 2022 has passed and President Biden signed on it. And we know America wants its fabrication share to reach 30% and above. Now, America's East Asian allies, namely Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, might worry that America wants much more. Semiconductor has been designated one of the key technology focus areas for which the newly installed Directorate of Technology inside the National Science Foundation, directly following the advice from National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence final report published last year. And you all remember President Biden's executive order 100-day supply chain review. And in that self-diagnosis, it was clearly revealed that America for now lacks fabrication capabilities, especially for the advanced nodes under 7-nanometer chips and advanced testing and packaging. So it is very understandable that America wants to use federal subsidies and tax credits to boost or develop further these capabilities. But what worries Asian allies are the remarks by members of key leadership. Take a look at the second one. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo at World Economic Forum in May, quote, "The fact that we are buying 2/3 of our chips from Taiwan, and these are the chips we need to keep Americans safe and secure. We've got to make those in America, period." And the third one, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, quote, "People look at Germany and they go, how could they have been so reliant on Russian natural gas? And then they're going to look at us and they are saying, how could we have been so reliant on Taiwanese semiconductors?" So Korea, Taiwan, and Japan might almost feel that in the long term, America wants to cut its tie to Asian allies when it comes to semiconductor industry. And for us, semiconductor industry is essential for national economy and security, and all three countries suffer from almost the same structural problems, like chronic low economic growth, population getting older a lot faster than we'd like, and in some, Asian allies also want meaningful presence in semiconductor industry global value chain in the future. And so the question is, what is the end game of the United States? And what would be the expected role or position of Korea? Is it just memory business, or does it include some portion of foundry business? And I should point out that Taiwan and Japan might pose a similar question for you. And on Korean corporations' investment toward the United States, we need some answers, or we'd like to discuss with our hearts open, what can America do for allies if China retaliates? And is it possible for us to at least slowly fade out our chip production capabilities out of China? Could you give us a room or sufficient time to get out? And I want to emphasize that Korea hopes a mutually beneficial co-evolution of semiconductor industry between Korea and America. Third topic, the case for Korea-America partnership in semiconductor industry. I believe that it happens to be a strong coincidence of national interests between us. And the current situation for America, I mean, sole reliance on Taiwan, is clearly a strategic vulnerability. And I think the relationship between America and Korea when it comes to chips is a combination of original technology and applied, refined, and mass-producing technology. It can work out fantastically well. The second rationale behind the case for our partnership is that the whole apparatus of semiconductor manufacturing demand on extensive implicit and operational knowledge, the sourcing network and process optimization parameters and all of that. And finally, as National Security Commission on AI adequately put it, we all know that there's going to be a values competition between alliance of democracies versus authoritarianism in the years to come. And now in the 21st century, technology is now a matter of national security. I believe that trust based on shared values and honorable history is a very important in times of grand challenges that will unfold upon us. Last topic, challenges ahead. There are always them challenges. First thing, restructuring semiconductor supply chains will be a daunting task. It's basically a complex system out of a spontaneous order, the equipment, materials, and talents. So mutual learning is a must, and it's going to require a lot of money, time, effort, and perseverance. But it needs to be done because securing a working and dominant semiconductor industry leadership in the hands of democracies is too important to lose. Second challenge is the inevitable cyclicality. Now the Federal Reserve is aggressively raising up the federal funds rate. The down cycle has already begun, I believe, and it could last a couple of years. I think we as allies need to have a coordination channel to avoid too much oversupply or overcapacity issues and create opportunities to purchase each other's products and services when things go south, giving breathing room for our companies. Last slide, I believe Korea and America can generate great synergy over many aspects of the semiconductor industry. And I want to finish my talk with a proposal of establishing a robust communication channel with participation of political leadership and corporate leadership altogether between Korea and America. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Hee-Kwon. I think you raised a lot of questions for your American friends, and Shahid, you have the last word, and probably you can answer at least some of the questions Hee-Kwon raised.
Well, I can try. I was going to focus a little bit on what American industrial policy could be and is going to be. So anyway, good morning and good evening. It's a real pleasure to be joining you on this forum. As you all are very well aware, last year, global sales of semiconductors amounted to almost 560 billion. And these devices are critical to the operation of some 200 downstream industries. The importance of semiconductors to the functioning of so many activities, as everybody well knows, brought home when the COVID pandemic disrupted production and trade. I think the severity of this shock inflicted by this pandemic was a wake-up call, as everyone is now increasingly aware, because it demonstrated the vulnerability of this very critical supply chain. And the US, Korea, Japan, and some of the European countries have responded by mobilizing a range of policies to minimize the risks from supply chain choke points. China, meanwhile, has been working to internalize much of the supply chain as perceived security concerns have mounted, and you talk about Fortress China and such like. Any lingering reservations regarding the efficacy of industrial policies in the Western economies have been largely swept aside. And as you very well know, industrial policy was a bad word in many circles in the United States for a very long time. So I will focus my remarks on the US response. However, I can see similar actions being pursued by Korea and by other countries. Because American companies aggressively pursued cost minimization and outsourced the manufacture of semiconductors, which was mentioned earlier, the US share of global production has fallen from 37% in 90 to 12% in 2022. So the supply chain as it exists today is complex, geographically dispersed, and exposed to geopolitical, economic, technological, and security-related pressures. No single country can fully internalize the semiconductor supply chain. I entirely agree with that. Nevertheless, by working together, the US and its European and East Asian partners can take steps to insulate the supply chains from shocks to come and from China. To achieve this requires the coordinated application of industrial, manpower, trade, technological, and demand management policies by governments in close collaboration with private firms that own or control all the elements of the supply chain. It's the private sector that can augment production capacity, reorient foreign direct investment to disperse certain operations, and secure source of material. Governments can speed up adjustment and change. Industrial policies currently being pursued or under consideration by the US and its partners in consultation with the private sector appear to have 7 objectives. The first as has been mentioned, a selective reshoring of semiconductor manufacturing. I don't think anybody is talking about a wholesale reshoring of anything. It can't be done. And there are limits to what can be done. Reshoring needs to include the production of cutting-edge 5 and 3 nanometer node chips, legacy chips, and components. A second objective is the friendshoring or nearshoring, again talked about, of critical operations and supplies, and possibly the creation of new regional research and production hubs. This calls for both a dispersion of some operations away from China and Southeast Asia, as well as an increase in the number of suppliers to build necessary redundancy into the supply chain. The onus is on private firms to treat resilience as a priority, to broaden their supplier processing networks, and where possible, secure multiple sources of raw material. I think that's really important. Undoubtedly, this will lead to an increase in costs. To make supply chains resilient, firms must embrace just-in-case operating procedures and collaboration with the government, enlarge the inventories of key inputs and products, which is also ongoing. A third objective is to strengthen the monitoring of supply chains by private firms and the sharing of this information with public agencies. Timely data sharing can help to identify bottlenecks in advance and avoid shortages. Greater transparency can enable firms to better gauge the status of second and third tier suppliers and take remedial action where necessary. The research, design, and manufacturing of semiconductors is highly skill intensive. Therefore, a fourth objective is to ensure that industry can access an adequate supply of skills. This cannot be done overnight. While the US has been able to overcome shortages by importing engineering talent, reshoring on any scale must go hand in hand with measures to build technical and STEM skills and channel them into the semiconductor industry, which is really not happening. This is partly the responsibility of the state in the US and Korea, but company training programs can make a vital contribution, as Intel is already doing. Enlarging the technical workforce, whether in the US or in Korea, must be a cooperative effort with public and private entities doing their share. Promoting technological advance to improve semiconductor performance, conserve materials, and minimize pollution depends on the volume and quality of research. This is the fifth objective, to support this research, much of which is conducted by the private sector. In both the US and Korea, government and university institutes are actively engaged in research on semiconductors that is shared with the private sector. More important are the fiscal and financial measures introduced to incentivize research by the corporate sector and startup activity, often a source of breakthrough technologies. Together, they can build research capital and make the ecosystem more innovative. Because no one country can create an entirely self-sufficient semiconductor production system, industrial policy must be meshed with trade policy. A sixth objective. This calls for collaboration with partners in Europe and East Asia to align incentives and avoid competing subsidies. It also involves removing or lowering tariffs on products in the semiconductor supply chain and targeting export controls more narrowly to serve national security interests and avoid overbroad controls. In this context, an updating of trade agreements could make supply chains more flexible and protect intellectual property. Finally, an objective of public policies, whether in the United States or in Korea or in any other country, is to signal a credible commitment to long-term policies that would sustain the demand for semiconductors and minimize the cyclical fluctuations to which the industry is prone, as was mentioned. For example, a commitment to greening energy, building smart grids, promoting electrification of transport, and harnessing digital technology to improve urban services would complement and also smoothen demand for semiconductors. Korea's efforts to strengthen the resilience of the supply chain are complicated by the need to balance its relations with China, as was mentioned, its biggest and fastest growing market, and with the US, which is pursuing a Chip 4 alliance. Investment by Samsung and SK in US-based semiconductor facilities supports friendshoring. Korea's participation in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework will improve coordination among members and reduce the vulnerability of the supply chain. However, it is in the interests of both Korean and US firms to maintain access to suppliers in China and to continue meeting China's expanding demand for semiconductors, components, equipment, and final products through exports. How this is achieved will depend on a mix of communication, cooperation, and trust building among partners in the Chip 4 Alliance, whose interests are not necessarily in sync, and careful handling of relations with China, as Young-Jip Bae pointed out. Thank you very much.
With that, let me open it up for a roundtable discussion. We already have very good topics suggested or thrown by the speakers today. For example, wisdom of reshoring or friendshoring, excess capacity issue, China factor, obviously, and what would be the US end game in this picture, and the private sector's role. So it's totally up to you. Who want to go first? Anybody who wants to make any comments?
Yeah, I'd like to have ask about industrial policy of the United States. As Professor Youssef said, we are watching a surge of industrial policy during the Biden administration, and many scholars have called for aggressive industrial support for reduced supply chain vulnerability and compete with China. Although CHIPS and Science Act are passed in Senate and Congress with full support, I think many scholars still have raised the issue on whether the huge amount of government subsidy is proper to, semiconductor industry, one of the most profitable industry in the United States. For example, I've heard news that Bernie Sanders, he said he felt very uncomfortable on this bill, arguing that this bill is kind of blank check for the semiconductor. And also, one of the main think tanks in the United States, Patterson Institute of International Economy, published a report that for the last 50 years, they examined 18 cases of industrial policy in US for the last year. And they argued that industrial policy has not always succeeded, saying that industrial policy has worked best when subsidizing R&D across a whole sector rather than subsidy or trade restriction. So my question is, how do you see the industrial policy this time? They're clearly focusing on subsidy and trade restriction on China. Could it, how it could work for the revival of semiconductor industry in China and in the United States? What's the probable effect of the industrial policy? Could it successful or how do you see? That's my question.
If I might just mention something, I think the real wake-up call has been the cessation of gas and oil exports from Russia to Europe. I think that has triggered a huge alarm here that suppose China were to invade Taiwan and Taiwanese factories are knocked out and certain supplies of rare earths, gases, and other things coming from China suddenly come to a stop, as they did in the case of Japan in 2010. What will the US do? The US does not have a plan B. So in order to minimize that kind of risk, a very expensive industrial policy is being undertaken. And I fully realize that many people have been writing against industrial policy in the United States. And I've been working on this for 40 years, and I know the history of industrial policy here, in Korea, in other countries as well. And I know the sort of mixed reviews it has received since, and the feeling that it's actually can lead to a huge waste of money. But I think in this case, the US has no option, given how dependent it is on semiconductors, and the fact that it only has a real advantage in EDA. It has some advantage in vapor deposition and polishing. It has some advantage in OST, but not in most other areas. And it does not, Intel aside, yet produce 5 nanometer node chips. So it has to do this. I don't think they're doing it lightly.
Mhm.
So I would
Yeah, you
strongly,
know,
I would strongly disagree, just so you know. I mean, I am a free market person, so I will put that out there. I think subsidizing extraordinarily profitable companies is not the way to create a stronger, more competitive market. And that's what the US has just done. And since they have passed this money and they're spending taxpayer dollars to support these profitable companies. And by the way, these guardrails are really funny. They have one in there about how they're not going to be allowed to use any of the subsidies for share buybacks. Okay, so they won't use that money. But if you look at some of the announcements by certain chip companies recently about what they are going to be doing in Q2, i.e. providing dividends to shareholders, this is all just, this is kind of a disgusting use of taxpayer dollars. Now, that said, I totally agree, by the way, that we have a resilience problem. And we, meaning not just the US, the globe, right? And Taiwan having, one geographic area where you're producing the majority of advanced node chips, yes, that is an issue. That is a resilience issue. And that is a problem that we should be looking at collectively. US, Korea, India, Taiwan, Japan, all those who share those values that were highlighted. And we should ask, how do we solve that problem? And my concern is, now that we've put this money out there, there are no metrics, there are no milestones, there is no articulation of how the subsidy recipients are going to be measured and assessed, and there are no no-goes, where if they don't achieve something in the first year, they don't get money. This is how we should be doing things, but this is what happens when the government tries to interfere with a free market economy. It just doesn't work. So I'm just putting out there a different point of view for consideration.
Did it work in Korea in the 70s and 80s and since, and in China since?
I would disagree that it's worked with China. I think China being China and China becoming more isolationist ultimately is not the way we want to behave. I think ultimately we stick to free market principles, we stick to the things that drive us toward excellence, we run faster than everyone else, and we collectively collaborate to ensure that we are ahead of authoritarian governments. So, I mean, it depends on how you measure success, but I would like to say, given that we have passed the CHIPS Act and people like myself, obviously we have to accept that we're going to be spending more money of our taxpayer dollars for these things. I would like to see at least an articulation of the metrics. Before profit-making companies get to just get more subsidies, I'd like to understand how they're being measured and assessed. I think that's the least we can ask for, because there is no free market correction for this kind of subsidy unless you put it in place like that. So I don't think that's asking too much. And I have not seen that articulated, because I haven't even seen the correct definition of the problem being solved, being articulated.
For the sake of discussion, let me play the role of devil's advocate, adding one more, factor to this complicated picture. So, the midterm election and the 2024 presidential election, how do you think this election cycle drives, if you will, the U.S. position on this, global semiconductor supply chains?
Well, doesn't it strengthen the hand of those who would like to pursue industrial policy? Because China's desire to be as autonomous as possible is a given. So whether the US likes it or not, China is striving for a very, very high degree of autonomy. And it is now able to produce 7 nanometer chips using DUV and argon immersion technology. It's only a matter of time before it's able to get to the very frontier. As far as chip design is concerned and legacy chips are concerned, China is already there. So it also controls, as you well know, most of the key materials that go into chips. including high purity silicon carbide. So China has achieved this. The US and its allies need to collectively, and I'm not saying all of it should be in the US, collectively need to create the resilience. The Republicans are really very much on board, and whether or not they sweep the House and the Senate, they are not likely to back away from this industrial policy. And I say also that there are facts on the ground now saying that some of this money is going into the latest fabs, which are being constructed in Ohio, in Texas, all over the place. So a lot of this is now a done deal. People are digging and putting those fabs down.
Those companies that are putting those fabs down had cash flows in their balance sheets in 2021 that were eye-watering. They didn't need these subsidies. That's my point. I agree with you that China is going to always try to become autonomous. That's clear.
Yes.
Okay, we have our industrial policy, our ITAR and all that stuff has driven them to be even more so, okay? I don't disagree with you on that. I'm simply saying that the more you have government intervention in a free market, in what is inherently a free market, the more you're going to weaken the free market corrective forces, the more you're going to incentivize weaker performance, and the less likely you are going to be able to outcompete China. We need to do what we do best. And in the United States, we should not look like China to beat China. That's my point. So we have, and by the way, I would argue Korea and Japan and many of our European allies who all really understand these principles also should collaboratively think about what problem are we trying to solve? Is it to keep China down, or is it to always stay ahead? China is 1.4 billion people, right? They're not the enemy. The CCP is the enemy. And as a global presence, we need to continue to enhance and make sure that our values are the values that are championed and taken forward. That's how we succeed. And we do that by competition, not by weakening our competitive forces. That's my point.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
We have around 10 minutes left for this roundtable discussion, and we will move to Q&A. So I think I should let our Korean speakers to speak up about the Korea's position or the issues the Koreans are working on. So Youngja and Hee-kwon.
I'd like to just mention one thing. When I hear your debate on industrial policy, the interesting thing here is in Korea, we have also, National High-Tech Strategic Industry Act, so-called Semiconductor Special Law in early this year. But interesting thing is there was no visible controversies or opposition against this law. So, it's very reasonable and good to see the debate, live debate in the United States. We Koreans are very familiar with industrial policy, very accustomed to it. So there is no discussion, no controversy at all. So it's very interesting. And I'd like to raise one issue, U.S. government continuous support to Korea's investment in semiconductor manufacturing. Korean companies' investment in U.S. Semiconductor sector are not made solely by market logic. Everybody knows that. As Maurice Chang, the ex-chairperson of TSMC, pointed out, operating a semiconductor manufacturing facility in the U.S. is much more expensive than in Taiwan and South Korea. Currently, U.S. government welcomes the Korean companies' investment in U.S. and promise, large-scale support. But as you said, next result of the next election or domestic political situation in the U.S. may affect, government support. So I think it's very important question for South Korea to get continuous support from U.S. government. One critical issue now discussing in Korea is the case of Inflation Reduction Act. Korean Hyundai Motor Company has decided to make a huge investment in the United States in the electronic vehicle battery sector. However, as the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act subsidizes only, domestically produced electronic vehicle, so Hyundai Motor Company in Korea was excluded from subsidy benefit. So a big controversy in Korea about Hyundai Motors being excluded from the benefit, despite the firm's huge U.S. investment. So the situation is a little bit different for semiconductor manufacturing, but the key point is the negotiation should proceed in such a way that the important investment decision made by the Korean firms in consideration of its alliance with the United States could be helpful, not only for the United States, but also for the, continuous development of Korea. So how I don't want to know how the American scholars and people see the Korea's U.S. huge investment. I mean, it's for their company's decision. It's Korean company's decision, but it's not market logic. They need some subsidy from government, but it's not guaranteed. So a kind of risk, have some kind of risk. So how you have any advice for Korean firms or Korean government to deal with this kind of risk and problem?
Before we
first, I have to mention a couple of things.
Okay.
Yeah, about the Chips and Science Act subsidies and tax credits compared to the continuous subsidy packages and all the policies supporting domestic exporting industries in East Asian countries. I have to say that American industry has been playing unfair game, I guess I should say that. And second, the damage done by IRA to Hyundai, as I heard of it, is not that much. And other companies in the world are facing the same kind of problems. And the law is now in its infant stage, and we can have more discussions like this to properly develop the relationships, industrial relationships between Korea and America. That's it.
Okay, Lisa and Shahid, do you have any comments or response?
Well, on the question of this, the subsidy for electronic vehicles exported by Hyundai, the problem has arisen that Hyundai's factory comes into operation in 2025. It's only then that their vehicles will be able to receive the subsidy. And so it's this interim period where the controversy has boiled over, that the next 2 or 3 years, direct exports from Korea will be affected. So, and as I say, direct exports from other countries, BMW or any of the other manufacturers that are not producing cars in the United States will similarly not benefit from this particular subsidy. So I think yes, maybe this will be ironed over in some way, but I agree that this should not be seen as a blow to Hyundai and as an unfair treatment for Korean manufacturers.
Well, as the free market representative, you can imagine my reaction to this, right? This is another example of why I don't like all the subsidy and stuff, because you're inhibiting competition. I think it should be as free as possible. I will also point out, though, as somebody who's got a PhD in physics, that electric vehicle subsidies by themselves need to be relooked at. There's the second law of thermodynamics will not be denied. Now, South Korea is a lot smarter about investing in nuclear power than the US. And so it actually probably makes more sense to be investing in electric vehicles in South Korea. But it doesn't, the second law of thermodynamics does not support the current investments there without a sustainable source of energy to charge all of those. And we've all seen some of the examples of the hilarious inconsistencies in California, for example. But that's another issue for another day. I just think more broadly, the less we interfere at the government level in markets that are clearly commercial and driven by commercial interests, the better off. That's just what a free market person thinks based on rational, logical thought. So,
But everybody has to play that game. If I look at what's happening to subsidization in China and across East Asia and the national champions in Europe, everybody is out there handing out subsidies. If the US kind of sits back, then its share of semiconductor production will go from 12% to 5%, and its defense industries will be completely at the mercy of foreign suppliers. I am as much of a free market supporter as you are, but I also look at the reality of international competition and the reality of industrial policy pursued by every major industrial country.
doing something that is wrong because other people do it because it is wrong does not make it a winning strategy.
This is a geopolitical environment which is highly stressed. This is not a place where everybody is playing by the rules.
Of course not. Nobody has ever played by the rules, and
Yes,
those who
but the
are the
US
best
cannot do
always
so either.
win. Those who are the best always win.
Th-
Do you
this-
think, I mean, we can go over case study after case study, but we don't have time here. And I'm not trying to turn
Let
this
them
into
all.
an argument about free market. I know this is a conversation.
Can I
about
say
free
just
market.
one more thing here?
Yes.
Just one more thing.
Yeah.
I don't have to be seen as a traitor to Korean people or some, but I seriously doubt that Samsung's investment toward the United States, targeting the system or foundry businesses, is not dependent solely on the pressure from U.S. government. It's strictly business, I think.
Thank you. Can we briefly talk about the China factor? Just briefly. My understanding today from what I heard from my Korean friends is that Korea is leaning toward Fab 4, joining Fab 4 or Chip 4, although China's economic retaliation, if you will, is expected. But obviously in the short or midterm even, there could be some economic damage that South Korea should take if that's the direction they're going toward. So what's South Korea's and the private sector's strategy, their plan to minimize the short-term economic damage?
Yeah, some are concerned that the Korean firms might experience difficulties in the production of semiconductor in China and export to China, as they expect retaliation after joining Chip 4. However, I think this card, I mean, Chinese retaliation about block export or block the production facility operated by Korean firm might not be easy to use, as it could cause a major setback in Chinese semiconductor growth. I mean, the most great damage, not to Korea, but to China, I think. So, but I think China could use other agricultural or cultural goods and some raw materials to retaliate to Korea, as it did in the THAAD deployment case. The problem is Korean economy is still too much dependent on China in terms of market and raw materials, and we know we are very vulnerable, but the problem is it's hard, very hard to prepare the risk and retaliation from China.
Do you have any comments?
Yeah, there's a saying that the best defense is an offense. So we are now having a cutting-edge semiconductor manufacturing capabilities in East Asia. So maybe that's our only negotiation tool against China. And looking back on our history, if there is a problem arising with China or Russia, the only diplomatic solution came from the cooperation with allies. So maybe we have to talk to our allies more closely and communicate well in the future, hopefully, and hopefully nothing bad will happen. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let me take the questions from the attendees. And the first question is also to Lisa from Chris. So I'm wondering how much standard setting will matter, especially when Chinese wafer capacity increases and US reliance on China-made chips increase, particularly in legacy chips. But what is stopping China from setting its own standards as US develops a reliance on Chinese legacy chips? Lisa?
Right. So the quick answer would be there's nothing stopping China from developing standards. In fact, China has broken that code, and they've realized that standards development is a critical element of global influence. And that's why they're so present in 3GPP today. That doesn't mean we roll over and cede that field, if you will. I always point to FAA and airline regulations as a key example of how you actually have global influence with 5% or 4% of the world's population. Everybody who flies internationally, regardless of country to country of origin and destination, must follow the FAA guidelines and must speak English as the language. And today we're talking in English. So those who set standards, regardless of where you are in terms of population, they have an outsized influence on global affairs. And I think the Chinese have cracked that code. That's why the whole 5G effort was so concerning to the US government in the prior administration. And so, yes, you absolutely have to think strategically. I think Korea, Japan, the US is terrible at playing chess. We play checkers in our policy. We think very linearly. We think if we do this in this domain, then China will not be able to do X, right? You've seen that in some of our ITAR and export control restrictions in the semiconductor domain. We don't think about playing chess. There's no restriction that China has to operate in a linear fashion against what we do. So I think we have to think far more strategically, and some of these really great questions that were raised by He Kwan, and I'm sorry if I haven't pronounced your name properly, are absolutely on target. We have to think in terms of shared values. How do we advance those values? How do we sustain those values in a world that is extraordinarily complicated, not just in semiconductors, but not just in technology. And we have to play chess, not checkers, in doing that. I thought you raised some excellent questions. The US can be extraordinarily myopic when it, and I have no other way to explain it, when it doesn't stop and say, what are the longer term outcomes of my short-term thinking?
Thank you, Lisa. The next question is from Sarah Marshall. How does education play a role in the ability for the US to continue to innovate in the semiconductor sector? Are the US and ROK engaging in educational cooperation in this sphere?
Well, education, particularly science education, I guess has a very critical role to play when it comes to bolstering the US's research capability. And as has become apparent, 75% of all PhDs working in the semiconductor industry are foreigners, are foreign born. And this is simply not a sustainable policy for the US to depend on foreigners to staff its research capacity and to staff also the critical industries. So encouraging people to go into these particular scientific fields, and once that they have gotten their PhDs and their engineering degrees, to go into the semiconductor industry and to these other strategic industries has become quite critical. And it's something that will take years to actually be successful if the government takes a very active role in this, government and the private sector. Whether there is any kind of coordination with Korea, I think I'll let our Korean participants answer that question.
If you try to educate people specifically for the purpose of going them into semiconductor industry, there's a risk. Oversupply or miseducated people could go into. There should be a mismatch, a lot of mismatch. Then that could be a problem. But Obviously, we are heading into that direction partially.
Mention one thing here, which is that if you look at the history of the USSR, they did encourage people to specialize very narrowly, and it did create a problem which you have referred to, that people had such narrow specializations that it was difficult for them to move across industries when a particular industry went into a downturn. So the mismatch is a real risk.
But in Korea, the interesting thing is about the quota of each department in Korean university. I mean, university could not increase number of freshmen in electronic engineering for the last 10 years because the Korean government, the quota for each department in Korean universities are still strictly regulated by the government, and surely interdepartment politics exist in Korea. So education system sometimes a great barrier to upgrade innovation system in Korea. It has contributed to Korean innovation greatly, but as Hegon said, it's not. We need to solve the problems from this kind of very strict and very rigid educational system.
Thank you, Youngja. Next question is from Mark Tokola. Are the U.S. government's and U.S. companies' interests the same regarding the semiconductor supply chain? If not, how do we iron out differences? So the public-private sector cooperation is not always smoothly done. So how do we iron out the differences? If you're in the White House, what would your recommendation?
Give subsidies, which is what they're doing. One of the reasons why there are differences is that producing in the United States was very expensive. And one of the reasons it was expensive was because everyone else is subsidizing public utilities, electricity, land, is providing grants, is providing fiscal assistance of various kinds. And therefore, it greatly reduced their cost. The other factor was that, as Tim Cook mentioned, if I invite a bunch of engineers to start a sort of operation, I can fill a room in the United States. I could fill a stadium in China. So China has been producing huge numbers of engineers, and therefore it can do things and start up things at short notice, which the US can't. So the US has failed in many different areas to support its semiconductor industry. And so private interests have led to the dispersion of this production to other countries. And so if you want to bring it back, you got to meet what other countries are doing in terms of support.
So you guys all know I disagree with this, so I won't hash it out again. I would just really like to see people like Shahid tell me specifically what metrics they're going to measure to tell me my taxpayer dollars are not being wasted. That's all. Somebody in the White House could just lay that out for me. I'd feel a lot better.
A lot will be wasted. I've looked at Korean industrial policy.
That doesn't make it right. Two wrongs do not make it right.
I know, but there is going to be waste. It's not that the private sector doesn't waste money either. I mean, for heaven's
That's why we have a free market. That's why companies go out of business, right? That's the point I'm making. There's no correction factor when the government wastes money.
Youngja, did you have any comments?
We are seeing very vivid and very healthy intellectual debate going on in this conference. I envy you guys. We should do that in Korea.
To be honest with you, this is the most exciting webinar I ever hosted. Thank you.
Good.
Well, I hope Shahid knows that, this is, the United States is actually, we like to think that we have the First Amendment for a reason, and we do enjoy a healthy debate. And I do think it's an example, frankly, if you don't mind me being a little philosophical here, of where I think we all need to get back to, is just being willing to have these conversations and debate. And at the end of the day, if Shahid was my next door neighbor, I'd still be going out to coffee with him, right? So sure. I think it's, I think that's what we try to, when we talk about shared values, right? The ability to speak freely without worrying about somebody telling us we're not allowed to have these discussions. So sorry for a little bit of philosophy, but I know we're ending the time, and I think I don't want people to go away thinking this is a bad thing. I appreciate Youngja's perspective here. I think we all should be happy to engage very honestly and have these, spirited discussions, because we'll both go away and think about what each other said. I will certainly take everything Shahid said and think about it and say, okay, did he have a point here? And I hope he'll do the same. I suspect he will. And then we'll both be smarter, and hopefully we'll have a better conversation going forward.
Thank you. Probably this is going to be the last question from Matthew at George Washington University. How will the CHIPS Act affect ROK Japan relations, Korea-Japan relations, and could this foster into a possible tariff war between Korea and Japan? I think this is a very interesting question. I understand there are some issues between Korea and Japan on in the semiconductor field.
I really don't understand how can the Chips and Science Act of 2022 could result in Korean-Japanese tariff war. Actually, I don't see the logic. But there's constantly a risk factor in the relationship between Korea and Japan, especially according to the party affiliation of the president of Korea. But we have experience before, a couple of years before, so our companies are well prepared, and our primary concern is now going into the United States and building some foundation for future growth in foundry business. So Japanese semiconductor industry is not that particular of interest or importance to South Korea.
Youngja, do you have any comment?
Nothing to add. Yeah.
All right.
But still, just in terms of high purity solvents and chemicals, Japan remains really critical for Korea's semiconductor industry, and restrictions on exports of those particular chemicals, which only Japanese companies can produce, is an important concern.
I think with that, we should conclude today's webinar. It's already past 10:30. I'd like to thank all the distinguished speakers for joining us today, especially our Korean speakers for staying up late at night for us. And I'd also like to thank our GW team for putting this together. And of course, thank you all for joining us. With that, let me conclude today's webinar. Stay healthy. Thank you, everybody.